Hello, everyone. Just want to begin with a word of prayer and thanksgiving. My mother is in the hospital right now, and they just shocked her heart. Her heart is not functioning properly, and they just shocked it, and it was successful. So her heart is back on rhythm, and I just feel so much gratitude to God and to all the forces of healing in this world, and to Kaiser. So, thinking of Bracha Basarat right now, and praying for her healing. And I just want to invite anyone else who is holding someone in their heart who needs healing to just enter that name into the chat, and we'll say Amisha Berach for all the cholim. Just calling on God to continue to to release that force of healing through the doctors who are attending to our our sick. Okay, so I'll say just the Misha Berach prayer. Misha Berach Hazen Avram Yitzchak Yaakov Sarah Rivka Rachel B'Leah Hu Yivarech V'Yirapeh Et Kol HaCholim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yimalei Rachamim Aleihem Lachzikam L'Rapotam V'Yishlach Lahem Refuah Shlema Min HaShamayim Refuah HaNefesh Refuah HaGuf Hashta Bagalav Azman Kari V'Nomar Amen. Okay, may our Torah is called a merapeh lashon. It heals the tongue, so it is a healing force. So may our Torah be a healing for all of those in need of healing. Okay, today I want to deal with and make an attempt to sort of grapple with a very, very difficult topic. A topic that it's so challenging that I usually just skip over it. Um, and that is there are many challenging episodes in the Torah. There are many challenging laws in the Torah. There are laws that we struggle with because um our kind of moral world has changed so much since the world of the Torah. Um, but then, sometimes I feel myself compelled to reconsider my own morality in light of maybe the Torah has something to say here. It's very, very difficult. I think this particular problem, and that is that the Torah condones or allows for the institution of slavery. That's a particularly difficult problem, not just because we are sort of revolted by slavery as an institution, um, in light of, especially in this country, in light of our kind of particular institution of race-based kind of slavery. In this sort of like these centuries of colonial and race-based and caste-based slavery, and all of the world has learned of the terrible ills, I think, of those, and yet slavery continues to exist in the world. Some say there are more slaves now than ever, but just by number. And okay, so that is to say, I feel, I think, as most of us do, the ethical um, discomfort of seeing in my sacred scripture a it's not a celebration of slavery. That's, well, as we'll soon see, that's part of the point. It's not a celebration of slavery, but certainly an allowance for slavery. That is all um, difficult enough. But I also want to say, just as a matter of literature and reading and tracking the themes of this book, it's all very strange. It's all very strange because um, the sort of the central story in this book is liberation from slavery. And that really is like the founding narrative of our people, the central story. Everything everything before Exodus is leading up to that, and everything after Exodus is sort of informed by that. So it's just weird. Like, how can a book put so much emphasis on the grand liberation from an institution of slavery, and then turn around and very quickly, as we'll soon see, turn around and I don't know what I'm not even sure yet what word to use. Just is this isn't justify and it isn't celebrate but it certainly is include in its set of laws and allow for. And what is going on there? And as I said, I usually just sort of skip over that because I was like, ugh. Um, um, but I want today to take a look at it in this week's Parsha, Parsha Behar, because this week's Parsha speaks a lot about liberation, actually, and liberation from slavery, even, and yet still has a lot of these problems. So I want to try to take an honest look at the Torah and to consider what theology, what more morality might be in place here, um, because it's hard to believe that that morality is slavery is fine. It's very hard to believe that just from the larger context of the Torah, and yet it would be disingenuous to claim that the Torah is just sort of like an in absolute condemnation of slavery. So it is like a weird space to be in. Okay, um, all trigger warnings presumed. Okay, let's say a blessing over Torah study. For those of us just getting a chance to learn for the first time today, it's a daily practice Torah study, and every morning we say blessings over Torah study. So, for those of us who are just getting a chance here at lunchtime, let's say a blessing together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here's where the problem begins. The problem begins um, in back in Exodus, actually, uh, not 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 it's not a problem that we encounter for the first time here in Parshat Behar. So let's start back in Exodus, and then we'll sort of move into our Parsha. So here is a source sheet for today in the chat. I will also share it. And we're gonna start back in Parshat Mishpatim, and we almost like every year in Parshat Mishpatim we do this. I do this. It's impossible not to sort of introduce the parsha with a big caveat. Parshat Mishpatim follows Parshat Yitro. Parshat Yitro is where the great revelation happens, and hooray, God's law and Ten Commandments, unbelievable. And then in Parshat Mishpatim, there's now a whole catalog of laws. Okay, you're gonna get a bunch of laws. Some of them, become classic institutions, like, social institutions like not defrauding one another, or even kosher laws and holidays are included. Okay, but the very first law is this one, and it'll look familiar, but let's just remind ourselves of what the problem is. These are the rules that you shall set before them. Elam mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem. Ki tikne eved ivri, when you buy a Hebrew slave, sheshanim yavod, that person shall serve 6 years. Uvashvit yetze lechavshi chinam, and then in the seventh year they go free. Okay, and then sort of famously, but if they don't want to go free, okay, well, let me stop there. Let me stop there. I have to be careful not to just ramble through this because I want to set this up carefully, so that we can see what's going on in our parsha. So let me just name the problem once again. We just came out of slavery. Seems like the last thing we now are gonna like claim this new relationship with God. Seems like the last thing that we would want to do is go back into slavery. That's the first law in Parshat Mishpatim. But of course, we could immediately say, no, no, no. The whole point is it doesn't last longer than 6 years, and then they go free. Okay, okay. But first of all, is slavery fine for 6 years? Now, here we must pause and say, wait a minute. Maybe slavery is even the wrong word. Like this word eved, la'avod, we can translate that in lots of ways. La'avod is to work. So an eved can be a worker. okay, or a servant, or if this institution, this 6 years and 7 years is true, an indentured servant, right? Which is really what matches this institution. So maybe what the language of service is, by the way, that language avodah, service, can also start to refer to divine service. The avodah on Yom Kippur is the service in the temple. So it is a very expansive word. So maybe actually it's not like, yay, back to slavery, but no, here's what we envision. You can have indentured servants, people who go into debt and pay their way off with labor, but that can't last forever. Okay, that's interesting. We still might not think, well, why didn't the Torah just say no one ever, but okay, let's just hold on. Then the slaves may say, this is one of the weird parts of the law, the slave may say, I love my master and my wife and children. I do not wish to go free. In which case, his master takes him to the doorpost and pierces his ear with an awl. And then he remains his master's slave for life. So that's weird too. Now, he can become a permanent slave, but why would he want to? But it's clear that there are situations in which someone might want to. Um, Maybe they've started a family there. Maybe they just like life better there. But there's a kind of a punishment for one. You can, and this is important. I just wanted to really state, you can stay a slave for life, but there's a punishment for that, it seems to be an indication that the Torah doesn't want you to make that choice. Okay, that's interesting. Just as a notion, Torah might allow for something, but prefer you make a different choice. And famously, Rashi says there, the ear on the doorpost. Of course, the doorpost is like the doorpost in Egypt, but the ear, Rashi says, Ozen sheshama Behar Sinai v'kibel et atzmo adon acher. The ear that heard the voice of God at Mount Sinai and went and bought and acquired another master for it.
Hi.
That's it's a disgrace. Okay, so that's okay. That's just the start. Is that we have this dilemma that there's some idea that you can become a slave again, and you could even become a permanent slave, but maybe it's discouraged. Okay, now with that in mind, we head into our parsha. Okay, now one more little thing before we head into our parsha, which is that our parsha is mostly about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. Okay, that's what it's about. It happens to have all these laws of slavery included in it because of some of those laws, but it's about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. Now, it so happens that we've already heard the laws of the sabbatical year. It's really the Jubilee that's introduced here. In fact, we heard the laws of the sabbatical year back in Exodus. In fact, we heard the laws of the sabbatical year back in Parshat Mishpatim, which we just saw the first law in Parshat Mishpatim. Well, later, 2 chapters later in Parshat Mishpatim, we get the first mention of the sabbatical year. And here it is. We're still not in our Parsha, but this information we have when we're going into our Parsha. V'sheshanim tizrat artzecha, v'asavta et vuata. 6 years you shall sow in your land and gather in its field. V'hashvi'it tishmatena. Okay, but the seventh, let it rest and lie fallow, and let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat, and you shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. Now, that's Shemitah. That's the sabbatical year. That's letting the land lay fallow. And it has nothing to do with slavery yet, except I will just note for the purposes of our class, it's also a 6 years work, 7th year go free. Okay? So that's actually a strong signal. There's only so many institutions like that in the Torah. Shabbat, the sabbatical year, and the years of work of the slave. 6 years work and then 7th year go free. So there's something connected. There's something here to think about between the sabbatical year and its regulations, which seem to be just about letting the land be unworked, but it's structured in the same way that you would let a slave go free. Okay, now we are ready for our Parsha and to see the sabbatical year being turned into the Jubilee year. Okay. Every 7 years is a sabbatical year. And as we'll soon see, every 50th year is the Jubilee year. And there are some laws that regulate slavery in this year. So let's take a look now. Okay, now we are in our Parsha, Leviticus chapter 25. Okay. Usafarta lecha sheva Shabbatot shanim. Sheva shanim, sheva pa'amim. Vayu lecha yemei sheva Shabbatot hashanim, teisha va'arbayim shana. You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. V'havarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi'i, ba'asor lachodesh, and you shall sound the shofar, the blast of the shofar trua, b'chodesh hashvi'i, in the 7th month, ba'asor lachodesh, on the 10th day, which is b'yom kippurim, Yom Kippur. Tavir shavar b'chol atzechem, and you shall sound the shofar in all of your lands. V'kidashtem et shnat chamishim shana, and you shall sanctify the 50th year. Ukaratem dror ba'aretz, and you shall proclaim. And here's a bunch of either release or liberty, some kind of freedom, dror, throughout the land. Lechol yoshveha, and for all its inhabitants. Yovel hiti elechem, it will be a jubilee. V'shavtem ish el achuzato, ish el mishpachto tashuvu, and it'll be a jubilee, and each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. Okay, now that there's a lot of setup here, but don't worry, soon we'll discuss all this. That is like a big moment. Ukaratim dror, right? You shall proclaim liberty. Now, you will know this verse if you've ever been to the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, right? Because this is the verse. It's always such so trippy to me that the liberty, that of all the things they chose, it was a verse not from Isaiah but from Leviticus, right? Not from Matthew, but from Leviticus, these Protestants chose. You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants thereof. Okay, so this line became a kind of a symbol for, let me see here. I'm going to give you my, I just published an essay on this. Hadar is sending out these essays. I always encourage you to sign up for them because I'm teaching this class, but I'm also writing these weekly essays. So if you like the Parsha, more Parsha, here is what I wrote on the just the word drawer, because there's a lot to think about. Just that grand proclamation, release. Now, okay, freedom throughout the land, liberty, as our founding fathers imagined it, right? But it wasn't exactly individual liberties and rights, the Bill of Rights Declaration. It's not like John Locke liberty. What is it? Well, we know that the land is resting, but it's not just the land, also the inhabitants of the land. How will they be released? Well, one thing is that what we've just heard is they all go back to their original homestead. Okay, but that's not about freedom. It's about the release of property and everybody going back to reclaim. So there's a kind of part of what the Jubilee represents is a kind of a reset button so that nobody owns, all the property goes back to the first parceling of land by tribes when they came in, which presumably was proportional to everybody. So economically, there's a lot to say about the Jubilee and its sort of radical economic message. But today I want to focus on the other great release, the other great institution of release in the Jubilee year. And here's where things get interesting / complicated. Okay. Okay. I said there's a lot of setup here, but I promise that soon we'll start talking about all this. Okay, here's really the meat of it. Okay, if your kin, meaning a Hebrew, one of your fellow Israelites, achicha, your brother, under you continue in straits. That person goes into economic hardship and must be given over to you. V'nimkar meaning is sold to you, but like not you buy, is sold to you, as in sells himself to you. Lo tavod oto avodat aved. Don't subject them to the treatment of a slave. Okay, now it's not like in Hebrew, it's weirder than that because subject and treatment and slave are three different words. In Hebrew, it's lo tavodbo avodat aved. Don't work him with the work of a worker. Okay, so that's interesting. Okay, remaining with you as a hired or bound laborer, they shall serve with you only until the Jubilee year, and then they, along with any children, shall be free of your authority. They shall go back to their family and return to their ancestral holding. Okay, what does that do in the Jubilee when everybody goes free? What happens? Who goes free in that year? Anyone who's in a 6-year contract, right? Because that we learned it can only go for 6 years. And who else? Also anyone who denied release from their 6-year contract. They go free. And one of the things was they maybe they weren't allowed to take their family with them. Well, now they are. Okay. So that might have been part of the problem, is that was holding them in the institution of slavery. Then their children are released. Okay. So the Jubilee, part of what it represents, and we can sort of celebrate this for a minute, but soon we'll problematize it. Part of what it represents is the release of everyone, almost everyone, the release of all Hebrew slaves, no matter what their desire, to force release almost them, and they go back to their ancestral homeland. Okay, that's the whole setup, except for one last thing, which is one last line that I want you to hear your thoughts on this, because well, I said at the beginning, what's the theology here? What is the framework? What's the moral world that the Torah is living in? Okay, like we might not agree with the Torah's moral paradigm, but it surely isn't slavery is good, because it even said don't treat them like a slave. Okay, now and what's the justification for all of this? And this is the line after all this that I want you to start thinking about together. Ki avadaihem, because they're my servants. Asher hotzeti otam eretz Mitzrayim, I freed them from the land of Egypt. Lo yimachru mimecheret aved, so they can't sell themselves into the sale of a slave. I freed them from the land of Egypt, so they can't sell themselves as slaves. Okay? And you shall not rule over them ruthlessly. You shall fear your God. Lo tirdebo b'farech v'yiretem elokecha. You shall not rule over them. And that line, by the way, I just have to say before I turn open the floor, that's a signal word. Where were slaves ruled over ruthlessly? The Egyptians, right? The Egyptians. Vidu Mitzrayim et bnei Israel b'farech. Ruthlessly, they imposed slavery over the Israelites. Oh, I think I skipped the word slavery. See, I'm just doing away with it with the type of a keyboard. Okay, so you see this is a signal word. So now you see that there is some consciousness here about what there's some reckoning, some working with the institution of slavery, and it's predicated on the release of the Israelites from Egypt by God, and that makes the Israelites God's not free. Here's the big dilemma. Not free, God's slaves. Okay, so let's start there. And we have some great interpreters, problematizers here. So let's start with Yonatan. Yonatan, with us? I can't hear you. Can everyone hear Yonatan? No. Can anyone hear Yonatan? Okay, let's try Noah next, and then just see if we can get Yonatan.
All right. This is always an interesting Parsha. One, because it's like a description of like the workforce we have with like the corporations having to work for them. Then everyone gets a huge vacation in the 50th year of work, getting their original property back. However, it seems in here it's only specifically for the Jewish people that are our brothers and sisters, and no one outside of that. So there's room for issues there, but it's also we're not allowed to serve two masters. We have the huge master up in heaven, then the sort of lower boss that's running the household and things that we're working for, but really in charge because the guy upstairs is the one running the show. And it's hard having two masters because we're trying to follow God's laws, but then the laws of the household there are quite different.
Yeah, great. Okay. Noah, so grateful for you. Noah does often kind of does a lot of the important work for us very quickly up at the top, and he's done that today by offering us two very quickly advancing the conversation in two important ways. One is to just articulate at least a basic formulation of what it means that they are my slaves, and so you can't treat them as slaves, and just to speak that out. Oh, now somehow what it means that we're slaves to God or servants of God, that requires further an analysis. But somehow, just as a matter um, of a business, you can't be someone else's slave if you already have a master. That's the way it works. And what God now represents, I'm not sure, it's somewhere between is and represents, because it's not a this is part of the problem to think through here. But God is the master now, and therefore you simply can't be sold to anyone else. And that's part of the theology here, that your relationship with God makes you either impervious to, or at least you should want to resist being subject to anyone else. Okay, that's important. That's certainly we can build on that, but that's the beginning of the theology that we're searching for here. But Noah also brings us another step forward by this is surely where we were headed all along, but this is all. I love this Torah so far because it's complicated, but it does seem like there's some messaging there that maybe slavery is supposed to be resisted, and it's God and not Pharaoh, and you never even treat a 6-year slave like Pharaoh would have treated us, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the big problem. Big problem is that the Torah then goes on and says, but these are the slaves, the male and female slaves that you may have. Me'et hagoyim asher svivotechem, mehem tiknu eved v'ama. From the nations all around you, you may acquire male and female slaves or servants. But these are really slaves because you may also buy them among the children of aliens resident among you, or from the families that are among you whom they begot in your land. So just not Israelites, but you could that the law governing the treatment of a slave and the release of a slave, those laws are governing Israelites to one another, but not non-Israelites. These can become your permanent holding, your property, in other words. Okay, so that's the problem. I don't know that we'll be able to solve that problem, but I mean that's like a real that's the part I skip. It's like so it's really okay to have a slave. Now, the presumption is you could also become a slave, like to another nation. And let me just say here that one way of dealing with all of this, the usual way, but well, I hope we can do better today. But one way of dealing with this is just to say, yeah, the world was different back then. Slavery was just part of the economy, and the Torah could not conceive of a reality, or if you're going to be a little more frum about it, you would say the Torah knew that the people could not conceive of a reality that was beyond the institutions around them, but you can see hints of pushing back against it. Hints. Okay, I don't know. I don't know if that does it for me, but that just let you know that's a classic answer out there. Eventually, we're going to get past slavery, and the Torah is just sort of nudging you in that direction. Obviously, it can't outlaw slavery, but it's just like, what? What about Exodus? Okay, so now we really have the problem, in front of us. On the one hand, we were freed from slavery, and that was a good thing. And now we're letting slavery exist in our society, but with all kinds of regulations. And actually, it's not really slavery. And actually, you'll be released after 6 years. And even if you choose not to, you'll be released after 50 years. But we still have slaves around. The store still allows for slavery. So I want to ask about that, not just as a way of expressing outrage at the Torah, but again, in light of this question, what is going on? Because remember, the only reason that Israelites can't be slaves is because God owns them. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that theology? That what's going on in that framing? Okay, so now let's continue to probe. Yonatan, I'm gonna try you one more time just to see if we have volume from you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we hear you now. Yeah.
Hooray!
Right.
Well, first of all, Rabbi, thank you for bringing up this difficult topic. It's not often enough that we study difficult topics. To me, the theology of the Torah around slavery, like so many other difficult issues in the Torah, is lo b'shamayim hi. It's not in the sky, and that comes from Deuteronomy, I think, chapter 30. Torah lives in the Jew, right? However, the Jew does Torah, as long as we're genuinely surrendering over to this construct, that's what it is. We get to define it. So yes, it's true that the plain language of the Torah says you can have slaves, but in practice, because of this law that we are studying, because you have to release slaves on the Jubilee, and we don't know when the Jubilee is, you can't own slaves. You can't own Israelite slaves. Canaanite slaves, you practically can't own for different reasons. Instead, what we get from the laws of slavery is the halachic minimum of how to treat your employees, right? Because every employee is entitled to be treated at least as well as a slave. So severance pay, for example, comes from the laws of slavery. Jews are required to pay severance to employees at a rate of 1 month per year that they worked for them. That was progressive when it was first implemented. That's still progressive, right? And that's a law that we have to protect employees, and that comes from the fact that we have laws about slavery.
Okay. Okay. Great. Great. So Yonatan really offers us a robust and theological answer here, which is exactly what I'm searching for. So I said that the standard theology of this, if it is, I mean, you could just say you could have a different theology, like the Jews are going to rule the world and everybody will be their slaves, but that's a theology I'm not so interested in. But the standard theology is, the Torah speaks in its time. It speaks to people where Maimonides famously says that, even sacrifices are a concession to just the world around. And that's okay. So I just articulated that. This is just sort of where the world's at. The Torah is there to nudge, forward. Yonatan offers us a different paradigm, which is not that the Torah sees itself moving in a particular direction, but actually that the Torah was given to us, and we are now partners in the Torah. And lo b'shamayim, in fact, it's now our turn. And so, why do we have this in the Torah in the language of the Talmud? Lilmoda v'lekabel schar. In order to learn it, figure out what's going on here, and receive reward for your learning. When does the Talmud speak in that language? In the case of the Ben Sorer Moreh, the rebellious son, the rebellious child, parents, if you have a rebellious child, you're supposed to take them to the court and have them killed. Okay? That's the law. But it seems that the rabbis just couldn't stomach that law, And so they kind of learned their way around, oh, this can't possibly happen, in exactly the way that Yonatan was just sort of learning his way around the law of slavery. Like, oh, it's never really going to happen, and in fact, we'll just draw these principles from it. We're learning a lesson. It's there for our learning, but it's never going to be. And frankly, the whatever era of Israelites holding slaves, ancient era, like it's not a major period of our history. So maybe it never really came to be. Maybe it wasn't so that is one approach here. And again, you could be a little more firm about it and say, and that God and God's divine wisdom saw that we would, interact with the Torah and wants us to grow. Or you could just be more sort of humanistic about it and say, there's only one way that this religion moves, and it's through people and people's decisions. And that's the theology, is that it's no longer in heaven. Okay, great answer. Okay, let's keep going. Let's keep working through this. I want to turn to Matt, who I haven't heard from in a while. Can't hear you.
Hear me? Okay,
Oh,
just
now
a
I hear you.
second.
Audio seems, I don't know what the issues are today, but I hear you now,
You
Matt.
hear me now?
I do.
Yeah? Okay.
Yep.
Two things. One, I don't think the Torah makes slavery less. I don't think it's trying to. I think it's what it is. This is the way the world is, and accept it. But where I thought you were going with this, because I find interesting, is this notion that we are God's slaves, because that's Islam. Very much, very explicitly, they are servants. That is their enveloping notion of the relationship between people and God. And I don't think that's our enveloping, but I didn't realize how based it was in us, how that starts with us that way. And like I say about a lot of things, I don't think it's that, well, slavery, we can't object to it so much as they have a different notion of property. I said this in the chat. They just have a different notion of how property works and its relationship of individuals to the community, because they're very group based, very community based, and things are not as distinct as we make them now.
Okay, good. Okay. I grateful always for Matt, and sort of expected not that answer, but that sort of approach from Matt. And in a way, I'm grateful that it's in the conversation, but it acts as a sort of a foil for me, because it's like I said, I'm looking for a theology here, and in a way, Matt is saying you needn't look for a theology. It was okay with them. In other words, it's a theology in the sense that this is God's law, but it's like what are we going to do? There's slavery in the Torah. Okay, but again, the main reason I'm not satisfied with that is because, again, the book of Exodus seems to be celebrates the liberation of slaves. And I think Matt would respond and say, well, no, that's what's interesting, is that there's some version of this that is exceptional. The Torah does accept slavery, but there's some great exception here. And in a way, Matt and I, as usual, are sort of on the same page, which is that the interesting part is this idea that we are now slaves to God. And Matt says, that's Islam. Well, that's Judaism. That's Parsha Behar, but it's all over the place. Let's take a look now at the chapter that we've been looking at closes with this language very, very strong, very, very strong. And this is really what I want to think about, the implications of this idea for us, for Judaism, but certainly for the institution of slavery. All right. So we just looked at how there can be Canaanite slaves. There can be Israelite slaves, but then eventually they have to be released because they're my servants. And then all of those laws are discussed. And finally, it says if the Israelites are not redeemed in any of the normal ways, meaning 6 years or the Jubilee year, or they buy themselves back, whatever, then that person, along with any children, shall go free in the Jubilee year. Sorry, that's the Jubilee year is what we're talking about here. And then one more time, just to repeat, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, avadaihem, as if emphasizing it, because the children of Israel are are servants to me. They are my servants. They are my slaves. Asher hotzeiti otam eretz Mitzrayim. Because I freed them from the land of Egypt, I, your God, Adonai, I, the Lord your God. Okay. So there it is again. They're my servants. They're my servants. They're my servants. Now, let me just fill this in a little bit. Let me just color this in a little bit. Like, what does that mean? And if I'm asking you, but if I were asking Rashi, Rashi has a way of expressing this. It is to me that the Israelites are servants. What does he say? He says, Shtari Kodem. My document is of an earlier date. Meaning, like, it's very, again, it's like formalistic. Rashi takes a kind of a business-like approach to it. God has now signed the document, and God owns us now. And that means we can't be slaves to anyone else. Do you hear how it's both technical and profound? It's like just a technical matter, but there's something profound about what, wow. Okay. Let me give you one more version of what does it mean? What does it mean that we are slaves to God? I'll give you one more version. This one's from another medieval, sort of same area as Rashi, the Rabbi Yosef Behar Shor, medieval French, I think Provence commentator. And he says the following. Now, for him, I'm going back to Exodus, but it just doesn't matter so much for our purposes. Back in Exodus, God said to Moshe, and I will take you to be my people. You tell them, I'll take you to be my people, and I'll be your God, and you'll know that I, Hashem, am your God who freed you from the labors of the Egyptians. And the Behor Shor, that's this other commentator, says, I will take you to be my people, and you will be slaves to me, because it's better for you to be my slaves than to be the slaves of Pharaoh. And I will be your God. I will be your master and not Pharaoh. And you shall know that I, the Lord, am your God, and you will serve me willingly, because you'll say it's better to serve the greatest of kings than to serve someone arbitrary like Pharaoh. Okay. So there's a couple of, there you have it. It's a couple of Rashi's and another commentator, the Behor Shor's, understanding of what it means to say that we are slaves to God, which is that it means we can't be slaves to anyone else for a technical reason, but on the Behor Shor says, but it's more than that. This is a better version of slavery. This is a better version of servitude. And notice, you'll choose to serve me. You will serve me willingly because it's so much better serving God than serving some random idiot. Okay, now we're really on the precipice of the theology here. So I want to like now start hearing folks really try to articulate what's the idea here? What is the idea? Like, we are slaves to God, and that is important, and it changes everything. So let's start with Hal, and then we'll circle around.
There. Sorry, hard to unmute. So I think it's important to distinguish between slavery and a slave society. Egypt was a slave society. Jews were enslaved as a people, and their redemption or their freedom from slavery was a collective event. It's the origin story. It is what defines them as a people. Slavery in Israel is smaller. That's not a slave society. Slavery was very small scale. It really revolved around individual relationships. It didn't define the nature of that society. So the whole analogy between having slaves in Israel and being liberated from Egypt is a kind of, it doesn't really help us very much because we're talking about really two different kinds of society and two different kinds of institutions. So the fact that the Israelites were liberated collectively, I think, gets to the whole theological issue that you're highlighting here, that, it's so they willingly become servants or slaves of God, but that's a very different process than what you have going on in terms of the treatment of slaves in Israel, because it's not a major part of that society.
Okay, good. So this is really helpful. This is helpful because we sort of suggested this at the outset. There's different. The word la'avod can be used in so many different ways. We may really be talking about different institutions. To throw the language of slavery around is so alarming, but servitude of other kinds are simply different. And in the ancient world, they were all kind of lumped under the same term. And again, you notice that word. You don't treat the Israelite slave bafarech with undue labor. That refers to Egypt, and in Egypt, a slave society, there was a whole industry that's run by the state that assigns a particular group of people to be slaves regardless of their circumstances and can work them brutally. Okay. So Hal's point is well taken, that it just simply may be that, yes, the Torah does polemicize against state-sponsored mass slavery, and maybe if the Torah had seen American slavery, the Torah would have been horrified by that also, but there are things the Torah simply wasn't horrified by, or at least allowed for, and that was just sort of like debt slavery and captives of war slavery, the more individual. Okay. I don't think, though, that it totally does away with the problem, because the Torah does allow for someone to be a permanent slave and to be presumably treated brutally if they are a captive of war. Now, that's still not state-sanctioned mass, but it's, I think, it's like, I think that is, let's just put it this way. My takeaway from the Egypt story includes that the principle that nobody should be subject to ownership and brutalization, right? So why is the Torah not saying that? Right. Okay. But yes, Hal's point well taken. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more comments. We're going to hear from Ariella and then Richard.
Well, to me, it just signifies the fact that, yes, even though there were slaveries, even though there were slaves, it's not the same as in Egypt. And I think that's also because we remember what it was like being a slave in Egypt, and that isn't how we treat people.
Okay. Yeah, good. Okay. Ariella and it sharpens the dilemma by saying that it isn't just that we were slaves in Egypt, and so you would think we wouldn't care for the institution of slavery altogether, or support it, or be handed it by the same God that released us. But um, um, that we have to remember is also a principle that expresses itself in the Torah in different. It's not just that we miss that. It's lo tanu et hager. You shall not oppress the ger. Ki gerim ha'item be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in Egypt. Now it's telling us that you can take the children of the stranger and make them slaves. So that's also what it was like. We do have an ethic of being compassionate to others around us, to being sympathetic to the pain of others, because we were slaves in Egypt or strangers in Egypt. Okay, so Ariel's right to say it seems like, and maybe we can turn Ariella's point into a kind of a theology of its own, which is to say, maybe back to that original theology, maybe it really is seated in the Torah that we're supposed to feel some kind of disgust, some kind of understanding of the pain of slavery. And even if it's allowed, we're supposed to pull back away from it. Okay. But so many things are not allowed. Why not just forbid this? Okay, one last comment from Richard.
Yes. So for me, I feel like the theological through line is that we are renters and not owners of property that we have. And the other part of that is that we live in the society we live in. and that within the society we live in, we're supposed to find the kind of more moral path that is less oppressive. And I don't think the Torah makes it easy for us in that 3,000 years later, we're trying to figure out in the capitalistic system we live in that has oppression and systemic oppression, what are the limits in terms of how we will function in a capitalist society if we're not sharing everything we own? What's the right level of charity? What's the right way to treat your workers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the moral challenge. And you have 613 mitzvot, but the hard part is figuring out what's in the interstices, and that's the challenge that we're given. That's timeless. And in the same way that, I mean, all of these laws about having to forgive debts and having to let slaves go and let the land lay fallow are all emphasizing that you don't own this. It's a gift from God.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. That's really, really a nice place to leave us, Richard, which is a really important reminder here that actually provides a whole framing for this conversation. And Richard says that we're all just renters, on this earth. And let's not forget, this is all embedded in the laws of letting the land lie fallow, right? And returning the land to its original parceling, which was not owned, but distributed by God. And there's some principle here that underlies all of this, the land and the people, that, wait a minute. You have all these institutions like slavery, but also like property, but they're not real. They're not real. And maybe that's the domain that the Torah is trading in. Here, let me just show you the line that Richard really reminds us of here. We started here, Parsha Behar, counting off 7 weeks of years, 7th month. Okay, now I'm going to click into it just so we see how this can be done. And here we are. If we scroll down to verse 20, what is it? 20, 24, V'haaretz lo timaker litzmitut. The land cannot be sold forever. Ki li haaretz. Higerim v'toshavim atem imadi. The land is mine. You are but strangers with me. Just like you were strangers in Egypt. You're actually strangers on my land too. Because ultimately, none of us owns anything. Certainly not each other, but not the land either. Now, the Torah allows for us to own land, and the Torah allows for us to sell ourselves and to buy each other. I don't think we've resolved the moral discomfort. I'm not saying that. But this is an important framing that the Torah seems to allow for things which it nevertheless puts under the shadow of, no way, you don't really own property at all. Nothing. Your house, your land, nothing. And similarly, yes, you can sell yourself, but you better go free eventually. What we do with the fact that other people can be sold and held in perpetuity, for that, and I think 1 minute left, I want to offer you this. This, to me, is the verse that there's more to think about here, but for me, this really offers me some direction. And that is a verse from the book of Isaiah. Very famous verse. Actually heard someone singing it at the outset of class. But this is a verse that we say during the high holidays. This is like a very important set of verses that deals with Isaiah, who is, because the Torah is thinking about the future 40 years from now, right? The future in the land when they enter in. But Isaiah is the one who's really thinking about the future, where does all this go? What does the Torah's vision go? And look at what Isaiah says here, and I think it's very, very important for our conversation. As for the foreigners, uvnei hanechar, who are joined to God to render service, lisharto, ulaavat et shem Hashem, and to love God's name, liot lo la'avadim, to become God's servants, God's slave. There's that word again. All who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and who hold fast to my covenant. And then this famous line, V'haviotim el har kodshi v'simachtim b'veit tfilati. I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. Ki beiti beit tfilah yikare lechol ha'amim, because my house shall be called the house of prayer for all peoples. Thus declares my sovereign God, who gathers to the dispersed of Israel. I will gather still more to those already gathered. So this is this is a lot to deal with, and there's, I'm just throwing it on you here at the end, but I just want to articulate the suggestion here, especially in the use of the word avadim. The foreigners from all the nations will come, and they'll be my servants too, my slaves too. And then it's like, oh, one day everybody will have God as a master. And what happens when you have God as a master? By definition, you cannot be sold to anyone else. So at least in this version of Isaiah, and he doesn't say they will serve me, lavot, they will be slaves to me. He uses that language again, liot lo la'avadim, they will be servants to God. So in light of everything we've said before, there is at least one vision that slavery will end, that permanent slavery will end in the future, because the goal of history is to have everyone recognize God as the ultimate master. And what you think of that metaphor is another class to have, but one thing that it does is that it says that no human being can be master over another, and that's a lesson that we still have to figure out, in all kinds of ways. Okay, thank you everybody. Wishing you a Shabbat Shalom. I will see you next week.